Hi, it's Katrina. The darkhad. The darkhad have been guarding the soul of Genghis Khan for 800 years. As the story goes, when Genghis Khan lay on his deathbed, he called for a shamanic priest. The priest then performed a ritual known as Sindarin Hurkag. This was meant to capture a small piece of the great ruler's soul so that it could be contained forever in the mortal world. The shaman plucked a hair from the forehead of a camel, put that in the Khan's mouth, and then when Genghis Khan exhaled his last breath, a part of his soul was transferred to that piece of camel hair. At least, this is what the ritual entailed. Following his death, the shaman who performed the ritual and 1,000 of the dead Khan's most ruthless warriors were charged with protecting that small fragment of his soul for the rest of eternity. Almost 1,000 years later, they still are. These people are called the darkhad, and these days they believe themselves to be the direct descendants of those 1,000 guards. They have passed down the stories of the Khan of Khans for 36 generations. Their duty now is to guard the mausoleum of Genghis Khan in Inner Mongolia. But there aren't too many of them left. In the 1800s, the darkhad was a small tribe who lived in wooden structures where they housed the artifacts of Genghis Khan. But they were devastated by a plague outbreak and didn't really recover until the 1900s. By the 1920s, the darkhad had retreated to the Ordos Desert, and there were fewer than 5,000 left. In the year 2000, a survey revealed there to be an astounding 16,000 people who identified as darkhad. But now, 22 years later, there are only a fraction of those people left, and there are only 100 of those legendary protectors still living to guard the Khan's soul. Kucuteni-tripillian culture. The Kucuteni-tripillian culture is one of the most bizarre earliest human civilizations. They were around about 7,000 years ago in Eastern Europe and were unusually advanced for their time. They made highly sophisticated structures, packed tons of people into their settlements, and practiced an organized system of governance. What makes them really strange is that every 60 to 80 years, they purposely burned down their settlements, relocated, and then built the exact same thing all over again. This Neolithic culture lived from between 5,400 to 2,700 BC and covered a vast area of about 135,000 square miles. This area encompassed much of Moldova, Romania, and Ukraine. They built their settlements about 1 or 2 miles apart, but why in the world they burned them down so frequently is still a huge mystery to archaeologists. And here's another shocking fact about the Kucuteni-tripillian. According to the BBC, excavations have proved that they could be the earliest people who exceeded a population of 1 million. That's almost unthinkable for 7,000 years ago. They practiced agriculture, harvested wheat, barley, and peas, and made fantastic clay pottery. But what possessed them to ritualistically burn down their settlements is just baffling. One theory is that it had something to do with their religion. It may have been some kind of symbolic ceremony involving the idea of death and rebirth. Some experts even say they may have done it as a way to rid themselves of evil spirits that had infested the settlement, like diseases. But the truth is that nobody knows for sure. The Kingdom of Commagene. The Kingdom of Commagene was surprisingly short-lived. They ruled only from between 163 BC to 72 AD, and were heavily influenced by the Armenians and the ancient Persians. They established themselves in Anatolia, located in modern-day Turkey, with their founder being Ptolemaeus of Commagene, a previous governor under the Seleucid Empire. But because the Seleucid Empire was in a major decline, Ptolemaeus used it as an excuse to declare Commagene an independent state and became its first king. Since the kingdom was located near the Great Euphrates River and bordered on the other side by the Taurus Mountains, it became quite successful through trade. Merchants were forced to cross through the territory, which brought tons of goods from all over the world into their cities. The one monument which this great kingdom is known for is Mount Nemrut, a fascinating site covered in statues. It can be found at the very top of the mountain, 7,000 feet above sea level. It was built right near the end of the kingdom as the mausoleum for Antiochus I. The kingdom finally came to an end in the year 72, when the Roman governor of Syria decided he didn't like how wealthy and powerful Commagene was growing and marched on their borders with a small army. The entire wealth of Commagene was then absorbed into the greater Roman Empire. The Urdu begis. During the Mughal Empire, there was a fierce class of female soldiers known as the Urdu begis. These women had the sole purpose of protecting the emperor and his harem. During this empire, which appeared in India in 1526, women were often famed for their fighting skills. For example, when the first Mughal emperor Babur rolled into battle against Ibrahim Lodi, he was accompanied by what was basically a vanguard of highly trained women from Kashmiri, Turk, Habshi, and Tartar tribes. They were feared by everyone, the royals, men, and were fiercely loyal to the king. To understand what was going on a bit better, we need to look at the state of female affairs during medieval India. The emperor always kept a massive harem of women, but they weren't all just to satisfy his carnal needs. Most of them practiced what's called parda, meaning they were concealed from their heads to their toes so that no man could behold their flesh. This tradition has been going on for centuries and was generally accepted by all the most noble families. So the emperor kept these women in a harem, which was a self-sufficient city of women that were completely off limits to any men. And to keep these women safe in their isolated city, the emperor had his legion of Urdu begis, or warrior women, to watch over them. Of course, not only them, but a small army of eunuchs as well. The Chavin civilization. The Chavin civilization was around for about 700 years, between 900 BC and 200 BC. They are actually one of the earliest cultures in South America prior to the rise of the Inca. They made incredible artwork that survives to this very day, and most likely influenced all cultural art in the Peruvian Andes that came after. Like many pre-Inca groups, the Chavin had a large assortment of interesting deities. One of their most famous was the staff deity, who can be seen as the central figure at the gateway of the sun in Tiwanaku. This deity was associated with agriculture and was usually depicted holding a staff in each hand. He would later become the Andean creator god of the Inca, Viracocha. What made the Chavin truly unique was their disturbing religious rituals, which involved everything from public bloodletting to human sacrifice. Their main religious site was Chavin de Huantar in the Mosna Valley, where over 1,500 people would gather to watch shamans take hallucinatory plants and then cut people open to siphon out their blood. And while the Chavin were eventually erased by the civilizations that came after, it was their system of beliefs which paved the way for all Peruvian religions up until the Spanish showed up. The Rurikid dynasty. The lands of Rus were ruled over by the Rurikid dynasty from between the 9th century until the year 1598. It was originally founded by the great ruler Rurik and his brothers. But after his brothers were killed, Rurik alone was left in charge of a massive region spanning most of what is now Western Russia, with his base of operations in the city of Novgorod. After Rurik died in the year 879, his son Oleg was the next in line to rule. One of his first actions was to take over the city of Kiev in what is now Ukraine. That became the seat of the Rurikid rulers for another several hundred years, up until the Mongol invasion in 1237. During the time the Rurikid ruled, the Eastern Slavic tribes outside their kingdom were forced to pay tribute in the ways of taxes to the Rus overlords, lest they be utterly destroyed. And because the Rurikid dynasty had such close ties to Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, Prince Vladimir converted his people to Christianity in 988. It was through conversion that the Rus territory could expand. The whole region of Russia and Ukraine became quite the force to be reckoned with. The Rurikids then inserted themselves into other royal families throughout Europe through marriage. This helped them to establish ties with royal houses all the way from Scandinavia to France. By the end of the 12th century, the lands of Rus were divided into a dozen different principalities. This eventually caused the fragmentation of the dynasty, since rulers started popping up everywhere and not everyone wanted to cooperate. Then, when the Mongols invaded, the already fragmented land was completely shattered. By the time the 14th century came along, the lands of Rus were much smaller. They had lost Kiev, lost their lands in Poland, lost Lithuania, and were forced to retreat to Moscow. The Kingdom of Rheged. The Celtic kingdom of Rheged is extremely mysterious. It has its origins in the region between northern England and southern Scotland. The kingdom actually formed after Rome had already conquered most of Britain, but failed to breach the northern lands or destroy the people there. And so, a people gathered their strength together beyond the border of Hadrian's Wall. Their stronghold was most likely in what is now Galloway, Scotland, starting around 550. But the truth is, we don't know very much about these ancient people. We don't know their exact borders or even the royal genealogy, because according to tradition, the kings of Rheged were all descendants of Cole Hen, known in folklore as Old King Cole. He's about as real as King Arthur, meaning he may have existed or he may not have. In the end, this kingdom rose and fell in the blink of an eye. Sometime before 730 AD, they were absorbed into the new and far more powerful kingdom of Northumbria, and much of their heritage was lost. We only know the names of 3 kings throughout their 200-year history. The Wanka civilization. The Wanka first appeared in central Peru about 800 years after the Chavin. It's interesting to take a look at this ancient culture and see just how things changed between the first major religious peoples of the Andes to those who came right before the rise of the Inca. They didn't live in the exact same place. The Wanka occupied the small area around Lake Junin in the highlands and dwelled in fortified cities at the top of hills and mountains. Their main specialization was llama herding. In fact, for the first 400 years of their existence, they didn't even farm corn. They relied totally on their llamas. They only started practicing agriculture when their population grew to be so dense that it could no longer survive solely on llamas and through trading. Quite unlike the Chavin, the Wanka didn't focus primarily on religion. They also didn't build great monuments. They focused primarily on herding their llamas and building their defenses. They lived in small settlements of fewer than 50 buildings, didn't even plan their towns, and stacked their settlements close to one another. These were shrewd people who gave the Inca Empire serious resistance when they started their conquest, and they were never completely subjugated. They even helped the Spanish put down internal rebellions during the first years of colonial rule, like the one led by Francisco Hernán de Girón between 1553 and 1554. The Illyrians. Modern Albanians are more likely than not the direct descendants of the great Balkan people known as the Illyrians. These were tribesmen who showed up in the western part of the Balkan Peninsula in the year 1000 BC, right at the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. For the next 1,000 years, they inhabited most of the region. The Illyrians domesticated horses, learned how to fashion iron and bronze swords, and ended up migrating as far as Italy. In fact, the Illyrians spread their seeds everywhere. Some historians believe even the Macedonians had some roots with the Illyrians, and the Thracians definitely had some major Illyrian blood. But these people were different in that they didn't really construct giant cities or anything. They were tribal, living much like nomads and operating under a chieftainship. They had a council of elders, but were shockingly primitive for such a large group. They even learned how to build boats and turned to piracy on the Adriatic Sea. One of the only Illyrian tribes that actually formed some semblance of a kingdom was in the 5th century BC. A population established itself in what is today Slovenia and began populating like rabbits. They soon had established quite the settlement, complete with feasts, ritual sacrifices, and sporting events. But like everyone else in the 4th century BC, the Illyrians were conquered by Alexander the Great, and after that absorbed into the Roman Empire. But they never really lost their independence. The Illyrians just kind of retreated deeper and deeper into the mountains as Rome deteriorated. They eventually, according to historians, became the ancestors of the Albanians. The Vijayanagara Empire. The Hindu Vijayanagara Empire was founded in the year 1336 and went on to last for over 2 centuries. They dominated southern India, which was impressive considering they started as nothing but a community of cowherders. They would ward off Islamic invasions and managed to subjugate nearly all of the ruling families in South India, even pushing out the old sultans. The empire grew to be so powerful and influential that they attracted travelers and adventurers from as far away as Europe. Unfortunately, they were smashed by the medieval Indian Deccan Sultanate, made up of 5 individual kingdoms ruled over by a Muslim dynasty. They began to decline after a major defeat at the Battle of Talikota in 1565. The empire eventually collapsed in 1614, and all their glory had been erased by 1646. The Yarmukians. The Yarmukian civilization in Israel came before the Israelis, before the Palestinians, the Greeks, and the Romans. Many years ago, the Yarmukians lived in modern-day Israel. Recently, archaeologists came across a shocking relic from the days of these ancient people, dating back to 8,000 years ago. The Yarmukian are considered the first prehistoric culture in Israel to practice agriculture, and one of the oldest in the Levant to craft ceramic pottery. They were also some of the first to worship a mother goddess. There was a fertility cult that worshipped a Mother Earth-type figure, and it's this mother goddess that was just found by archaeologists memorialized in a large ceramic figurine. It was discovered next to the wall of an ancient house, broken but still in remarkable condition, considering how old it is. Some of the red that had once covered the statue was still visible, with the color red representing fertility. Anna Eirik Rose from the Israeli Antiquity Authority said this statue is a hallmark of Yarmukian culture. She has big hips, a pointy hat, eyes shaped like coffee beans, and a large nose. Her eyes were most likely meant to represent kernels of wheat or barley, while the big hips represented childbearing. It's just a small representation of this lost culture, but still shows how incredibly advanced they were. These people lived at a pivotal point in human history, when people stopped foraging and started building permanent settlements. The Stone Cult. In Saudi Arabia, archaeologists found evidence of a highly advanced civilization which predates Stonehenge. The evidence was found in a vast and remote landscape in the northwest region called Al-Ula. The buildings here date back way before other major ruins in the area, like those of Hegra and Adan. This area was occupied in the Neolithic period, from around 6000 to 4500 BC. There are over 30 dwellings and tombs scattered throughout the desert, and there could be a lot more that have either been totally destroyed or remain hidden under the dirt. There are also over 1,600 rectangular stone structures that date from around the same time, and researchers aren't sure what they are. They seem to be potential animal traps, pens used to catch galloping animals in huge numbers for sacrifice. The truth is that archaeologists don't know what they were used for, only that they were built by piling rocks into low walls and then filling in the gaps with gravel. They could have been used as the foundations of buildings. It's a complete mystery. One thing's for sure is that all these ruined buildings and mysterious structures are evidence of an organized society that predates Islam by about 6,000 years. These were highly advanced humans who had likely transitioned from hunting and gathering to building small stone homes and forming cults focused on animal sacrifice. The Comox. Off the coast of Vancouver Island, British Columbia, in the area around Comox Bay, there is a field of wooden stakes stuck into the water. These wooden stakes appear when the tide goes out, looking like a bunch of broken pieces from sunken ships. These ancient wooden stakes jammed into the watery ground are complicated fish traps. They were left behind by the Comox First Nation people. These fishing traps were so uniquely good at capturing fish that the system had probably been able to catch thousands in a very short time. It was such a monumental achievement for the natives that it remained in use for over 1,000 years, starting sometime in the first millennium. The tragic part is that all these years later, even the modern descendants of the Comox who live in the area had no idea what the wooden stakes were. They knew they had something to do with fishing, but even the elders couldn't remember how they were used or what style of fishing it was. That all changed about 20 years ago when anthropology student Nancy Green started to investigate. It took a lot of time and a lot of studying, but she eventually learned the secret. The supposedly primitive Native Americans on Vancouver Island had created the largest ancient fishing trap ever found in North America, and possibly the biggest ancient fishing trap in the world. It's been described as a breathtaking display of engineering genius, and here's how it worked. The native people used pieces of wood from the Douglas fir trees and western red cedars, somewhere around 200,000 of them, to make 300 individual traps. They then connected all the traps together over several acres of tidal lands and worked to gather mass amounts of fish. This huge trap fed around 12,000 people with pretty much no effort. They would have only had to go out and scoop up the fish. Sadly, the practice was forgotten when the Canadian government banned Indigenous people from practicing any of their traditions. Around the same time, they were kicked off their land and locked up in reservations. Palmyra. The ancient archaeological site of Palmyra, found in modern-day Syria, was established sometime around the 3rd millennium BC. It began as a small settlement beside a fertile natural oasis, and eventually rose to become a major city in the Near East and a prosperous trading town on the Silk Road. There is no name for the people who first lived here in the Stone Age. Recorded history doesn't really start until around the 2nd millennium BC, when the Aramaeans controlled the city and it was a Mesopotamian settlement. The Aramaeans are a fascinating people because not only were they highly advanced and conquered much of the Near East and called the land Aram, but because they are also still around today, living mostly in Israel. When the Arabs arrived in Palmyra in the 1st millennium BC, they assimilated themselves with the existing population, and Palmyra became one of the world's first diversely populated cities. It became known as the Pearl of the Desert. It was an oasis in the middle of nowhere, so Palmyra became famous as a place of shelter and rest for traveling merchants and their caravans. Palmyra became rich and allied itself with the Seleucid Empire. However, when it fell, the Romans came. By the year 64 BC, the Romans had conquered Syria and Palmyra, although the city remained independent for a while, and there was a rich culture of people from all over the region, including Romans and Persians. The Persians would go on to conquer the city in the 2nd century AD, and then the Roman Emperor Aurelian destroyed it out of spite in 273 AD. Palmyra was rebuilt shortly after, but from then on it never really reached any kind of glorious height. It was conquered, abandoned, and ruled over by so many different people that it lost all power and uniqueness until it was totally deserted in 1400. The Dinosaur civilization. The Dinosaur civilization is just a theory, but it's related to the question, was there intelligent life before humans? This theory says that millions of years before our most distant ancestors arrived on this planet, there was a different civilization. A pre-human civilization that had technology, if not as great as ours, then at least pretty close. Because the truth is that after a couple million years following the extinction of this mysterious civilization, all trace of them would be gone. Any cities they would have built would have disintegrated. Whatever farms they may have grown would simply be reclaimed by nature. And even if they had plastic and metal, that too would ultimately decay given enough time. If humans were to vanish today, our buildings would be nothing but dirt in a few thousand years. Even the biggest cities we have wouldn't be recognizable in 10 million years. Let's say this ancient civilization, perhaps of human-like animals or some reptilian that grew a brain too big for its own good, only reached the technological level of the 1700s. There would be absolutely nothing left of them, nothing at all. For all we know, there was an entire civilization of intelligent beings that existed millions of years ago, but there is no way we would be able to tell. Rome and China. Ancient Rome and ancient China were two of the most technologically advanced civilizations in the world. Have you ever wondered if Rome and China knew about each other, or what their relationship was? After all, Rome ruled everything to the west, while China dominated much of the lands to the east. It makes sense that they had at least heard of one another. And the truth is, they absolutely did. And it was all thanks to silk. When silk arrived in ancient Rome, spun and woven and transported along the Silk Road, the Romans loved it. Where do you think the term Silk Road came from? The Romans didn't really know where silk came from or how it was made. Old Roman sources even claimed that silk grew on trees, which is kind of half true. Silk cloth is woven from the silk taken from cocoons, which are left in the trees by silkworms. It was in the 1st century AD that General Pan Chao of the Han Dynasty sent an ambassador to Rome. At the time, the Chinese called the Roman Empire Da Tian. In the year 97, the ambassador from China journeyed along the Silk Road and wound up in Mesopotamia. He was planning on sailing the rest of the way to Rome, but was told that the journey would take up to 2 years. He was thwarted, gave up, and went back to China. No contact was made. It wouldn't be until the year 166 that contact was made. Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius sent an envoy to China. This was a huge success and was the first direct meeting between the Romans and the Chinese. Although in the end, the kingdoms were so far apart it made little difference. Everyone kept enjoying the goods that merchants brought from so far away. The Canadian Clovis. Outside the small village of Mortlach in Canada, there is a place called the Casey Jones site. It was from this site where archaeologists collected evidence of some of the very first human encampments in North America. It was Casey Jones himself, an amateur archaeologist, who first came across an arrow point in the early 20th century, then alerted archaeologists. Since then, all kinds of amazing artifacts have been found, and they all date back to the Clovis culture, the very first culture that flourished in North America after the end of the last ice age. What's even more interesting about the discovery is that the Clovis arrow point was discovered by Jones in 1924, and only one other has been found that's like it. The other was discovered in Folsom, New Mexico. This suggests that when the Clovis came to North America, some clearly stayed in the colder regions of Canada, while others in their group marched south and made their homes in the desert. While a lot of people may think of the natives as primitives since they didn't build stone houses, they were just as advanced as their counterparts in Europe. It's believed that from this very site, the Clovis had an encampment and a meat processing facility. They turned raw bison meat into pemmican, then traded it as far south as Minnesota. The Shyama Bay culture. A newly discovered site in China has revealed a shocking and previously unidentified Paleolithic culture. This culture was responsible for great technological innovations at a time when massive cultural diversification was happening in Eastern Asia. It was a time of cultural hybridization, 40,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens were almost definitely breeding with other forms of hominins. Evidence of the mysterious culture was discovered at the site of Shyama Bay in the Nihewan Basin. There are archaeological sites here that date from 2 million years ago to 10,000 years ago, stretching pretty much all of human evolution. Researchers found the earliest evidence of ochre processing here, as well as very ancient stone tools. These stone tools are some of the most interesting finds, since very little in the way of stone technology has been found in China. These stone tools are special in that they don't look like stone tools found anywhere else in the world. The blade-like stones, for example, were highly advanced even 40,000 years ago. The blades were incredibly sharp and showed evidence of being latched onto a handle. This may have been the very first culture in China to fix rocks to sticks, sharpen those rocks, and then use them for cutting animal matter, scraping hides, and even performing primitive surgeries. Amazon River Civilization. Evidence has been discovered of an ancient Amazon River civilization, and they were hugely advanced. Laser scans were used to discover the ancient sites hiding along the greatest river in the Amazon, these settlements long abandoned and left to be overgrown. Researchers say the architecture and infrastructure of these cities would have required massive engineering knowledge. They say the people who built the cities were even more technologically skilled than anyone else in South America. That would include the powerful cultures of ancient Peru and Colombia. Take, for example, an ancient site just discovered near the village of Casarabe in northern Bolivia. Heiko Prumers from the University of Bonn investigated the remains of structures deep in the jungle here. Heiko found the eroded remains of pyramid stumps and the crumbling platforms of what had once presumably been temples. This was where the lasers came in. The area was scanned, and the scans revealed even more structures hidden underneath the foliage and buried underground. This was a massive culture living centuries before the Spanish showed up, with pyramids so huge they could have rivaled the ones in Egypt. The people of Karahan Tepe. Karahan Tepe is a monumental site in the country of Turkey, currently challenging the scientific theory on when and why human beings first settled into villages. Turkish authorities recently excavated this site and learned that it was home to a wildly advanced civilization 11,400 years ago. Archaeologists uncovered houses, a vast ritual complex, and monuments carved into the slope of a hill. The site itself is located in the cradle of civilization, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and yet it thrived long before the days of the Sumerians or Akkadians. What's truly boggling is that the discovery of this ancient complex flips everything we know about the advancement of human civilization on its head. Because, as you might know already, agriculture was not invented 11,400 years ago. The first people to start working the land didn't do so until about 10,000 years ago. And yet, whoever the people were who built the massive ritualistic temples and structure of Karahan Tepe did so without being able to grow their own food. In other words, the existence of this ancient place proves that agriculture was not the cause of settled life, but rather the effect of people settling into villages. Whoever lived here did so without farming a single vegetable for 1,500 years. The Egyptian cult of Isis. The ancient Egyptians positively loved the goddess Isis. She was the divine protector of the dead, the wife of Osiris, and the mother of Horus. She was worshipped by cultists for over 2,000 years before her influence spread beyond the Nile and perforated the Roman Empire. The cult of Isis was such a big deal that they constructed a temple in London, back when it was called Londinium, in the 1st century AD. The goddess is said to have been born from the primordial gods of earth and sky, Geb and Nut. She married her brother Osiris, who was then murdered by their jealous brother Set. Set chopped Osiris into pieces and scattered him across the world. However, Isis found his pieces, put him back together, and he is revived as Lord of the Dead. It's because of her origin story that Isis became the goddess of resurrection, which became one of the most important facets in Egyptian society. The oldest mention of Isis comes from an inscription on the wall of a tomb in Saqqara from around 4,500 years ago. She was worshipped locally by her own death cult and revered by the priests who mummified people. Mummification was all about resurrection, which was something that Isis had mastered. It wasn't until Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BC that her cult expanded beyond the Egyptian border. She became popular in Greece, and cultic death temples sprang up in places like Israel and as far away as Britain. The skull cult. Archaeologists in England have recently revealed a primitive skull cult from 15,000 years ago. It's now become disturbingly clear that Paleolithic humans were involved in cannibalistic rituals for unknown purposes. Archaeologists have known for a long time that the prehistoric humans of England practiced cannibalism, but this newest discovery has pushed things to the extreme. It seems that after members of this mysterious cult skinned a victim's dead body, they consumed their meat, inscribed strange symbols on their bones, and then sucked out the marrow. They also apparently turned the skulls into cups like creepy dishware. The new evidence for this terrifying ritual comes from Gow's Cave in Somerset. Archaeologists found human bones with cuts and tooth marks, indicating they had been munched on like cobs of corn. The researchers also found skulls that had been modified to be used as dishware, and it was most likely for ritualistic purposes. Sylvia Bello from the Natural History Museum in the UK says the prehistoric cultists had been aware of what they were doing. Sylvia says the victim was partially eaten until bone was exposed. Then the eating paused while symbols were sketched onto the bone. However, the group didn't keep the bones with the inscriptions on them. Instead, they finished their meal and threw the bones away. Researchers can't figure out why they did this, or what the ritualistic purpose of the cannibalism was. The only theory right now is that the cult may have been feasting on their dead friends as a way to transfer knowledge. They may have believed that by eating meat of dead loved ones and scrawling symbols on their bones, they would absorb their knowledge and power. The Vikings and Valhalla. In Viking mythology, when a warrior died in battle, they would be ushered into a glorious afterlife by a female figure called a Valkyrie. The Vikings genuinely believed the only way to die was in battle. If a man didn't die with a sword in his hand, he wouldn't be welcomed into Valhalla, Odin's great hall of warriors. Valhalla was a warrior's paradise, a great drinking hall built of spears and shields, and filled with as many beautiful maidens as a man could desire. The belief in Valhalla was like a warrior cult. According to Tom Shippey, an expert in ancient Vikings, it was likely their fanatical belief in Valhalla that gave them such success in battle. Tom describes the Viking mindset as a death cult, a psychological phenomenon that made the Vikings absolutely fearless. Unlike other warriors who were afraid to die, Vikings welcomed death with open arms. To them, death was only the beginning of what would be a tremendous life. However, Valhalla was not the end. The Vikings believed that Ragnarok was coming, and it was inevitable. Ragnarok would be the end of everything, and a great battle at the end of the world. Those brave warriors who had died on Earth would have another chance to fight, this time side by side with the gods at Ragnarok. This in itself was motivation to pick up a sword and fight at every given chance. The cult of Dionysus. In ancient Greece, there were so many cults it would take hours to talk about them all. Greeks loved being involved in these groups, although their cult activity was a little different than what you might be thinking. These people weren't drinking poison fruit punch. They were celebrating gods and myths while drinking a lot of wine. In fact, the cult of Dionysus was one of the preferred cults in ancient Greece due to its encouragement of copious wine drinking. Dionysus was the god of wine, fertility, and religious ecstasy. He had two festivals held in his honor, the Dionysia and the Linnea. The festivals usually included lots of drinking and lots of revelry and partying. These celebrations mostly focused on discarding a person's inhibitions and getting closer to nature by embracing physical pleasures. It's easy to see why so many Greeks took a shine to their favorite god. The cult of Dionysus worshipped their god through a ritual known as the Dionysian Mysteries. The ritual involved consuming not only copious amounts of wine, but also substances that could induce a trance, like hallucinogenic drugs. During this ritual, people became extremely intoxicated, danced and played music, and chugged alcohol out of bullhorns. The cultists believed that the intoxication felt from consuming these mind-altering substances was caused by Dionysus' spirit. In their minds, the god's spirit entered their bodies, got them drunk, and helped them to shed their stuffy human morals. The Egyptian cat cult. One of the most popular cults in ancient Egypt worshipped a cat, or rather a feline goddess named Bastet. In the ancient city of Bubastis, a great cult was formed to give praise to Bastet, who was seen in countless images and statues from ancient Egypt as a woman with the head of a lion. She was a true lioness, and it was her cult temple in Bubastis that formed the focal point of the city. The famous Greek historian Herodotus visited the place in the 5th century BC and described it as magnificent. He even witnessed the festival of Bastet and said it was the most elaborate of any religious festival in Egypt. There were massive crowds, with everyone participating in rampant drinking, dancing, and general fun. The cult of Bastet was to the Egyptians what the cult of Dionysus was to the Greeks. It was an excuse to party, get wild, and drink until they got sick. Baal. Throughout the history of the ancient Near East, Baal has been the name applied to multiple different deities. He is the antagonist of the Israelite cult of Yahweh, and he was worshipped as far back as the Akkadian Empire. His name is at least 3,400 years old, and he was king of the gods in the ancient city of Ugarit in modern-day Syria. The original story of Baal involved him dying, descending into the underworld, and returning to life to be the king of the gods. Many scholars believe his story was the very first in a string of death and revival mythologies that came after it, including the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Baal is best known for his role in the Bible in the story of the Phoenician princess Jezebel. The story takes place around 842 BC, with Jezebel encouraging the worship of Baal. She was part of the cult of Baal and married the Israelite king Ahab, who also worshipped Baal instead of Yahweh, the Israelite god. In the end, Jezebel was murdered. The prophet Elijah declared Yahweh the one and only God, and the Baal cultists were executed, and their temples were destroyed. Even though this is a biblical story, it has a solid base in reality, as the 9th century BC was a pivotal point for world religion. The Israelites believed in the one true God, Yahweh, while much of the world was still worshiping a wide number of gods and participating in cults. The Canaanites worshipped Baal, who had already been around for thousands of years, but he was slowly and surely replaced by the new cult of Yahweh. Baal, like so many of the old gods, was eventually cast aside. He would later become the figure Beelzebub in the New Testament and be linked to the Christian devil. Cult of Artemis. The coastal city of Brauron in Greece was settled around the year 3500 BC. It remained a small and peaceful settlement up until the 8th century BC, when Athens was formed. Around this time, the great ruler Theseus unified the 12 settlements of Attica to form what became the greatest city of the Mediterranean. The town of Brauron was no longer a town, but a district. It morphed into a religious site, the most important place in the ancient world for the cult worship of the goddess Artemis. The cult of Artemis was unique because it was primarily occupied by women. Artemis was goddess of the hunt, the wilderness, the moon, and chastity. Women flocked to Brauron to join the cult because it was centered around fertility and childbirth, as well as the symbol of a strong female goddess. Around the year 500 BC, a temple was built in the goddess's honor. And shortly after that, the sanctuary of Artemis Brauronia was constructed in the heart of Athens on the Acropolis. The most famous ritual performed by the cult involved a girl's transition into womanhood. Teenage girls would travel to the sanctuary of Artemis from all over the region, and they would undergo an intense ritual overseen by the priestesses. The young girls would wear the skin of a bear and walk 15 miles from the sanctuary in Athens to the original sacred temple in Brauron. The journey was supposed to represent their passage from childhood into womanhood. Sadly, Xerxes and his Persian army destroyed the temple when they invaded in 480 BC. Neolithic cultists at Avebury. Avebury is a Neolithic monument that is less well known than Stonehenge, but is equally fantastic. It's a huge ceremonial monument that covers over 20 acres and is 1,000 yards in circumference. There were originally 98 standing stones in the outer ring, with 2 more circles of standing stones inside, kind of like a bullseye. It was built about 5,000 years ago, and most likely began with a mysterious cult and a great stone altar. A research team from the University of Leicester recently discovered a hidden stone square at the very center of the monument inside its 3 rings, which they believe was built before any stones were erected. They found that the square was originally encompassed by a mysterious wooden structure that is no longer there. Nobody knows exactly what was built here, only that it was the first piece of the puzzle, and everything else sprouted up around it. Researchers say it may have been a ritual space, a simple shack with a stone altar where a prehistoric cult came to potentially perform sacrifices. The rest of the stone rings came up around it as time went on, and eventually, the structure in the center was lost. The cult of Cabeiri. The cult of Cabeiri is very mysterious. The Cabeiri was a group of deities that may have origins in ancient Phrygia. They were worshipped across Macedonia and many parts of Greece. Researchers believe the deities were most likely promoters of fertility, and that they were believed to protect seafarers. In classical Greece, there are 2 main deities in the group, Axiocersus and his son Cadmilus. There were also 2 female deities, Axieris and Axiocersa, though they weren't worshipped quite as frequently. Those who worshipped these deities were part of a mystery cult. These types of cults in classical Greece were fringe religions, dominated by secrets and often referred to as mysteries. These were groups of people who worshipped a god or goddess, or some other strange deities, and held their rites and rituals as closely guarded secrets. For example, the famous Eleusinian Mysteries was one of these religions, one of the most popular in Greece, and yet so secretive we don't even know what the cult did 2,000 years later. The members of the Cabeiri cult possibly performed fertility rituals and rites of purification. However, like so many of the mystery cults of ancient Greece, nobody knows all the specific details. The cult fell out of favor around 323 BC with the death of Alexander the Great and the fracturing of the Macedonian Empire. Mithraism was another mystery cult, only this one appeared fairly recently and was popular among Romans. The Mithraic Mysteries, as they were also called, had its followers worshipping a deity from ancient Iran named Mithras. Mithras was the god of friendship, which seemed to resonate with the Roman people. The first Mithraic cults were formed in the 1st century AD, and cult activity spread across the Italian peninsula. The cult eventually seeped across the borders and into the rest of the Roman Empire. Followers of the cult were called votaries, and they frequently worshipped Mithras in caves or any other dark and mysterious place hidden from the public. Researchers believe this wasn't done to evade authorities, but to make members of the cult feel like they were a part of something special. The cult was all about building close connections and belonging to a family. However, something happened with the Mithraic cult that was never seen before. It blew up, and hundreds of temples wound up being built across the Roman Empire. What began as a fringe group of cultists worshipping in caves became popular, and Mithras was soon openly prayed to in huge temples from Britain to Syria. The cult became a major religion, and it would have kept spreading if not for the establishment of Christianity in the 3rd century AD. Christians began destroying temples to Mithras, and most of the followers of the cult either gave up or were converted by the 5th century. Thanks for watching! Which of these mysterious cults did you like the most? Let me know in the comments below, and also let me know if you'd like to see a part 2. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you soon. Bye!